of the book. And she was discussing with me, when did we start thinking about the book? And I have to say, we started thinking of the book 6 years back. 2006, maybe even 7 years back, 2016 possibly. And she'll say a few words about the history of this project that we started 7 years back. But it's great to have you here. We did this book launch events in South Africa and India. And now, of course, very much pleased to have it in ESCAP. So, Amrita, over to you. Maybe a little bit of the history of the project and then, of course, the vision behind the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kunal. Very good afternoon to all colleagues, friends. It is great pleasure for me to join all of you in the launching, although it's not quite a launching of the book. The book was out last year, right? Already. But more of a dissemination of the work, of the contents, of the substance, of the recommendation of the book, especially as it relates to our region, Asia Pacific, in which 3 countries, right, are in the as case study in the book: China, Thailand, as well as Indonesia. Yeah, so in that context. So if I may go a little bit back to the history of the book, in which Kunal already alluded earlier a little bit, yeah. So Kunal and I started to think, when did we start actually? Yeah, we a little bit fuzzy, our memory, but I think we started this 2016, not quite 2017, a little bit way back, yeah, 2016, more as an academic undertaking actually. And our colleague that is connected online, I'm sure Andy Sumner is also here, joining online from London, King's College. Yeah, so basically he was like the team leader of that particular undertaking, research undertaking. Yeah, through the Economic and Social Research Council, right? UK, that was the sponsor. And we had several, as I remember, maybe 3 or 4, yeah, discussion, mostly in London. And then the last one was in Thailand, in Bangkok, hosted by Chulalongkorn University, Department of Economics. I remember the dean was also there attending the discussion. That was like a workshop. And that particular one was, if I'm not mistaken, 2018. Yeah. But then, at that time, the research was more on poverty dynamics and inequality. So the relationship between poverty and inequality, and taking also lessons learned, examples from a few countries, yeah, because the experts that were invited coming from many countries. And then after that, 2018, Kunal Sen was appointed as UNU-WIDER director a bit earlier, maybe one or 2 months before me. He joined UNU-WIDER, I think, August, September. Then I joined ESCAP starting in November. So then it started to develop further, in which I remember that at that time, at the last meeting, when it's already clear that Kunal will go to UNU-WIDER, he said, well, don't worry, we will take up this further, through UNU-WIDER. So therefore, then the research developed further into structural transformation and inequality rather than poverty dynamics and inequality, because again, the issue of inequality also closely linked with structural transformation, which is the concern of many countries, especially least developed countries, when they would like to develop further. So definitely the core issue is how they can structurally transform their economy as well as their society in a more inclusive manner. So that is basically the core of the objective of this book. So therefore, Kunal, I'm sure, will explain further the objective or the core questions of the book, as well as the findings, taking examples from the 9 cross-country studies. Again, the 9 cross-country studies, although it will not do justice for, as a representation of the countries in the 3 region, but at least, it will shed lights on the experiences of the particular countries, how they develop, their development, what journey have evolved, the lessons learned, as well as policy recommendation. The 9 countries, again, maybe in the book a little bit needs some correction. East Asia, I think better to be the subtitle to be named as East and Southeast Asia, because East Asia usually our understanding is China, ROK, Japan, and so on, right? Whereas Thailand and Indonesia is in Southeast Asia. So East and Southeast Asia. For our region, including also several countries in South Asia, India, Bangladesh, right? That are the sample for South Asian countries. So therefore, 5 countries in our region, Asia Pacific. So going forward, although it's not quite there in the discussion in the book, because again, the book discusses the experience of countries, in the past, not going forward, especially before COVID. So going forward, hopefully, in terms of recommendation, this can be also taken into consideration. So those are all these mega trends, including the mega trends. Those are, for example, the emerging technologies, including IT, ICT, this digital transformation for sure. Second is climate change. Now is big. With this significant impact to many countries, and also other issues. Including for our region, one particular issue that will have significant impact already, that is demographic change, structural demographic change. Because some countries are undergoing aging. Some countries have young population, which will have quite different implication, including in terms of policy. So with that, again, a real pleasure to join all of you, and looking forward to the presentation by Kunal, as well as to the ensuing discussion. Thank you very much.
Can I have the slides up, please? So before we get to my presentation, I just wanted to give you a sense of agenda for the rest of this afternoon. So I'll first present the main findings of the book, the core substance, but also the tools of analysis we used, the main finding, also the policy recommendations that we also have. So I'll give you the overview of the book itself, including all the other countries we have in our sample. And then we have the discussant. Very really pleased to have Hamza Ali Malik here, with the director of MPFD. Everybody here knows Hamza very well, and really pleased Hamza's here. And then we have the 2 countries presentations. First, Thailand, the case study of Thailand, Walirat Supanachat, who's at Kasetsat University, with Peter War, who's joined us online from Australia. And the discussant is Achanun Kopaiwun, who's at Thammasat University. Achanun, we know for also very well. Thanks, Achanun, for joining us as a discussant. Then followed by a presentation of the Indonesia case study by Andy Sumner, Professor Andy Sumner, that we already mentioned, joining us from King's College, London virtually. I think Andy's already online, followed by a discussant by Titik Anas, Special Advisor to the Ministry of Finance, and also the Pajajaran University. So really pleased to have very distinguished panelists and discussants too, presenters and discussants too, for the rest of the afternoon. And we are going to have time for about 40 minutes for Q&A with the audience. So you here, and also the online audience. I want to say that, what we'll do is really sort of, we're not asking the panelists here, because again, we also want to see the presentation. So each time we have a presenter, come over here, make your presentation. There will be slides offline, and I might not deduce you one because it will mean several trips to the lectern for me. But hopefully, once the presentation gets over, the next person can come and also make a presentation. So hopefully that running order is clear to everyone. Yeah. So let's get started with the main slides presentation. And I don't know if can I have a clicker? Thank you. So this book, and the book is actually displayed here, right here. First thing actually very important is open access. So you don't need to buy a copy. It's open access on our website, right? So it explores the tension between structural transformation and inequality in a range of low and middle income countries. I'll speak a little bit about the case selection of country because that's important. As Mohammed mentioned, sample selection and representativeness is an important question for any comparative project. I'm going to provide an understanding that was offered by different paths to structural transformation. There's no unique path to structural transformation. There are different paths. And we speak a little bit about that and what do we see across the countries we have. Brings together empirical research analysis from leading international scholars. We're very lucky to have excellent country authors for each of the countries, along with others who are involved in the editing team. So the editing team that we had, the editors we had is Ibu Armida, Ali Jabana, myself, Andy Sumner, and Arif Yusuf, who's at Pajajaran University in Indonesia. So we have a set of 4 of us in this as editors. And as I said, the book is available open access with the license that we have here that allows you to download the book and look at it and so on. So what is a developer's dilemma? The developer's dilemma, if you think about economic development, there's been a very influential argument by Simon Kuznets, who won the Nobel Prize in economic science, that essentially when you are going through economic transformation, inequality almost invariably increases at the beginning. Maybe over time, maybe not, as countries have moved quite a bit in structural transformation. But at the very beginning of the process of transformation, you see inequality increasing. So this challenge that policymakers are facing pretty much everywhere in the global south is I want to see economic transformation. I want to have economic growth that's broad-based and inclusive, but I'm also probably going to see inequality increasing over time. So what do I do about this? And so this is potential tension between these 2 goals around inequality dynamics, which is the developer's dilemma. And so the questions we asked in the book were, and every chapter had to address these 3 core questions using very similar methods, very similar data sets. We want to make it really comparative across countries. So you'll see when you look at the chapters, they are all following the same approach, using the same data sources and same methods. So it makes it really easy to compare chapters. So it's not apples versus oranges comparison. It was very important for us in this book. So what are the varieties of structural transformation that have been experienced by developing countries? What inequality dynamics are associated with different varieties of structural transformation? And what policies have been utilized to manage trade-offs if there have been policies? And sometimes they haven't been enough attention to policies when this kind of situation of structural transformation accompanied by inequality increasing has been evident in the countries in question. So we're going to look at these 3 questions for the countries in the sample. So there are 9 country comparative case study with a common framework and data set. There's about 30 different scholars from around the world leading to this OEP edited volume. And the country case studies, East Asia and Southeast Asia. China, that's absolutely right. We should have mentioned that that was unfortunate. We put all the countries in Southeast Asia along with East Asia. That's not correct. East Asia, Indonesia and China, Indonesia, Thailand, South Asia, Bangladesh, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana, South Africa, Latin America, Brazil, and Chile. So, you can say it's pretty much covers the global south. One thing that was very clear to us that if you talk about structural transformation, there has to be evident that has to be evident in the country in question. So many low-income countries, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Asia, in the Asia-Pacific region, haven't really started the process as yet. In other words, most of the workers are still in agriculture. So we were clear that if you're looking at the countries, there have to be countries where we've seen movements out of agriculture into manufacturing and services. So that explains to a large extent our country choices. For example, in Sub-Saharan Africa, many low-income countries cannot be included in this comparative dimension, which is why it's Ghana and South Africa, which have made this transition, or to some extent, at least for Ghana, in towards manufacturing services. That's why we included Ghana. South Africa, of course, has made this transition for many years now. Latin America, same thing. Brazil and Chile have made this transition, are beginning to make this transition, and same argument holds for the Asian countries. There are many other countries in Asia where this transition still hasn't happened as yet. So that's important to keep in mind. So what tools did we use to examine the challenge? First of all, the important thing is that when you think about structural transformation, especially when you look at manufacturing, and there is an issue that should manufacturing be the sole focus, but here we look at only manufacturing, then there are two things that matter. One is what is happening to employment in manufacturing as a share of total employment, and what is happening to value added in manufacturing as a share of total value added. Those are two dimensions that matter. And of course, you can have a situation in countries that are doing well in employment increases, but not so much in value-added increase, and vice versa. And if you look at the Asian countries here, and not all of them, just the Asian countries, you can see that, that you don't see, you can see that India and China, for example, have seen this big drop in agriculture. So on the left-hand side is agriculture, right-hand side manufacturing. Big drop in agriculture employment share at the bottom left, but there's been very little change in value-added share, which is saying that this country's workers are getting out of manufacturing to employment, but out of agriculture, out of employment, but agriculture productivity is increasing because value-added share is pretty much constant in these countries. And the developing East Asia, there is a similar picture. Employment share is falling, but value-added share not really changing in agriculture. And of course, the counterpart of that, you can see is manufacturing, employment, and value-added. In that, you can see, particularly China has this remarkable increase in value-added share, huge increase in productivity, with some increase in employment also. And same thing you see with India to a much lesser extent. And in high-income East Asia, you see a situation where basically you see a big increase in value-added share and a fall in manufacturing employment because these countries are getting out of manufacturing into services. And to some extent, also you see that developing East Asia. So these are very broad brush pictures, but you get a sense of how this movement of agriculture, both in terms of production and also in terms of employment, differs even in the Asian region. Forget about comparing with Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America. So even there, you can see the different trajectories in this movement, even within the Asian region. And we'll get to that as you look at the country case studies. So the first tool we use, we use two simple 2x2 cell typologies. And again, for economics, typologies are very useful because they help us to understand complex phenomena in a relatively simple, intuitive way. And allows us to then understand exactly the process at work when we look at these typologies. So, for example, when we look at transformation and types of transformation, we see basically 5 possible outcomes. All right. So one possible outcome, the top left, is manufacturing employment is increasing and value-added manufacturing share and manufacturing share is falling. And we call the primary industrialization. Right? Employment increasing, but value-added share declining, which is basically saying that actually manufacturing is becoming less productive, right? And then we have a situation where manufacturing employment share is falling and value-added share in manufacturing is falling. There's a bottom left, and that's secular deindustrialization, which is something we observe quite a bit in advanced countries because they move away from manufacturing to services, but we shouldn't expect that in developing countries. And then on the right side, you can see the best possible outcome is employment shares increasing manufacturing and value-added share increasing in manufacturing, which you call upgrading industrialization. So that's the best possible outcome. Manufacturing employment, creating jobs, but also becoming more productive. And finally, on the right-hand corner, bottom right-hand corner, advanced industrialization is when manufacturing employment share increasing, but value-added value share of manufacturing increasing, but employment share in manufacturing falling. And that's something which is telling us about productivity increasing quite a bit in manufacturing and employment falling behind. And finally, this fifth cell, if you wish, is where nothing's really happening. The stalled industrialization. And in fact, we'll see there are quite a few countries in this particular cell. So nothing's really happening, neither in value added nor in employment manufacturing. So this is the 5 kind of outcomes, we might say. This can differ over time. Countries tend to move from one part of this typology to another part, and that's quite possible. But this is a simple way to characterize the way we see manufacturing-driven structural transformation across the different parts of the developing world. Now, if you look at countries that have gone through spent some time in one of the quadrants, then the 2 countries which we observed are quite interesting because they're in 2 different continents. So Indonesia has actually followed the best possible outcome, which is upgrading industrialization for a long time, till about the mid-1990s, where manufacturing employment share was increasing and so was manufacturing value-added share. The best possible outcome from structural transformation. You can see that in both for value-added on the top and employment at the bottom, that has been the case. You can see the bars for the amount of workers in manufacturing and value-added in manufacturing, both increasing over time. So that's a good a very good outcome, at least in the case of Indonesia. South Africa is almost the perverse, completely opposite outcome. In South Africa, basically, we've seen employment shares decreasing and value-added shares decreasing at the same time. So in South Africa, from a relatively large manufacturing base, both have shrunk, both productivity, production, and also employment. So we see these very different patterns and different continents. Of course, there's a question here that are these continental differences or are these to do with country-specific factors? But that particular question we can take forward in the Q&A. And then we have a second 2x2 typology, which is the Cousinating Tension. As I said, named after Simon Kuznets, who first thought about this as a potential tension in economic development. So income inequality can be increasing or stable or declining. Growth enhancing structural transformation, which is manufacturing, employment, and value-added increasing, can be weak, may not be happening, or can be strong. So you can see a lot of workers moving out of agriculture into manufacturing, along with productivity increase in manufacturing. And so if there is a situation inequality is increasing, a potentially bad outcome, and you have weak growth enhancing structural transformation, we have a weak or adverse Cousinating tension, right? Inequality is stable or declining and growth enhancing structural transformation is weak. It's an ambiguous outcome. I mean, at one level, you might say, well, inequality is falling. Isn't that a good thing? Of course, it is a good thing. But at the same time, if we don't have growth enhancing structural transformation, if a situation economic development is not happening in that country for a large extent. So that's an ambiguous outcome. So one good outcome, but another one not so good. And then we have a situation in the right-hand side, top right-hand side, you see a very strong structural transformation, along with increasing inequality, which is the absolutely classic Cousinating tension. That inequality is increasing with structural transformation. And finally, the bottom right, we have the best possible outcome, which is that inequality is falling or stable, and we have strong growth enhancing structural transformation, the best possible outcome. You can even call it the sweet spot, because that's an outcome that you can have both good things happening in inequality, if you wish, and also in structural transformation. And of course, the question is then which countries and when have been in this different four possible outcomes over time. So that's the second typology use in our framework. So what can we learn from country experiences? Well, the first thing we notice when you look at the path of structural transformation is that 6 out of 9 countries have had at least one episode of upgrading deceleration. The good possible outcome is structural transformation. You can see a whole bunch of countries on the top right which have gone through this upgrading deceleration. Not forever. No, there were periods where they had that and then it stopped, but there were periods of that kind, which was a good outcome. And then you see that most of the countries have experienced stalled deceleration or deceleration also. The bad possible outcome, which is that you have this situation of employment and value-added manufacturing falling, declining over time. So that's very interesting that you see this 2x2, a whole cluster of countries in one period in the top right, and a whole bunch of countries that have different periods in the bottom left. On the other hand, you see very few countries have experienced primary or advanced deceleration. Now, advanced deceleration is not surprising because these are not high-income countries to a large part, and especially the period we're looking at for these countries. So advanced deceleration can happen in the UK, the US, or Germany, but very unlikely in a developing country, right? Because they haven't really gone through that process as yet. That's why they're not high income. But so that's not surprising. But we also see a couple of countries which were in prime deceleration. And so, so that's also interesting. India is in one of them in that quadrant there. So we have seen that the worst possible outcome is prime deceleration because employment shares are increasing, but productivity is declining. So basic point here is different pathways of structural transformation at different periods, but the overwhelming part of example here is of upgrading or circulative deceleration. Very few examples of advanced deceleration or prime deceleration, and a bunch of countries that are stuck in the middle. Okay. And then if you look at, so I want to give a few graphs just to help you understand what's happening over time in these countries. Unfortunately, we can't go country by country. We'll hear about Indonesia and Thailand later, but not go through every other country. But what we see again, let's ignore Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America for the time being. If you look at developing Asia, developing East and South Asia, excluding China, and high-income East Asia, then we see really interesting patterns, because in the developing Asia, taking China out, we're trying to find that inequality has actually been falling over time for the countries we have in our sample, but there's been very little change in manufacturing employment share, which is the horizontal axis. So the vertical is the Gini, the inequality measure. Horizontal is a manufacturing share of total employment. And you can see not much movement in employment shares, but a drop in inequality, which is interesting because we know also even within these countries, we have different experiences of inequality. The high income East Asia, we see inequality increasing substantially actually over this period. This is a 30-year period, inequality increasing substantially. And actually, if anything, employment shares falling. Employment shares falling, yeah, we can understand because these are countries, we are now almost on the way to become high income, but inequality increasing is obviously something that's of concern, and it's quite a sharp increase actually in this group of high income East Asia. Now let's look at China and India, the big two large economies that are there along with Indonesia in this book. And you can see in China this remarkable increase that's happened in employment shares. Again, horizontal axis employment shares, manufacturing, vertical is inequality, Gini. And you can see this large increase has happened from a 6% per share of manufacturing employment to around 18% over this period that we have data for. And at the same time, towards the end of that development process, from the 2000 onwards, inequality is going up very, very sharply. So it goes up and it stabilizes a little bit, declines a little bit, but the overall level from the 2000s versus a level in the 1990s till the 1990s or 1980s is quite different. So that's interesting. In India, the inequality increases also there, but much more gradual. And so that's also very similar, but it's not as sharp. And employment share has also been increasing. So in these two countries, the basic point is we see the Cousinating tension absolutely starkly. In these countries, we have growth enhancing structural transformation, but we've seen fairly large increase in inequality. So they really fit the Cousinating model very, very well. And of course, the question then is that what kind of policies have been adopted or not in these two countries where we've seen inequality increasing. So now, that was the point about structural transformation. Now, what about the Cousinating tension? And how many countries have been in the better parts, in the best possible outcome of inequality falling or stable, and we have structural transformation? Well, not very many actually. And you see a whole bunch of countries which have had inequality increasing along with weak structural transformation. A bunch of countries in the top left. Some countries where you have inequality stable or declining, but also weak structural transformation, bottom left. And then top right, the Cousinating tension, already mentioned China and India, and there are a few other countries there. And then when we look at the bottom right, you see only 4 countries. And in that also very limited periods. The 4 countries are one from Africa, South Africa, one from Latin America, Chile, till the 70s, one from Thailand till the mid-90s, and one from Indonesia till the mid-90s. And of course, we know in Thailand and Indonesia, there were other periods which were not in this situation of where we had benign or the best possible outcome. Now, the South Africa story we are quite uncomfortable with, and there was a lot of discussion on the South Africa chapter, in part because that was also the period of apartheid, right? So we're not very sure that's a good example for us. But the 3 good examples to think about and to then ask, why did these countries avoid the Cousinating tension? How did they manage to be in the sweet spot? Are Chile, Indonesia, and Thailand for this period that we're looking at, right? What happened in these countries? What did they do right? Okay, so I'm not going to get too much into Chile because I will speak quickly of the Indonesian, Thailand case studies. So to introduce the presentation later on, I'm going to hear about. Indonesia actually is really interesting. We are using available data from our own data set, database in UNU-WIDER. This is the WEAT, the World Income Inequality Database. So we feel confident about this data. Manufacturing employment share, we're using also existing secondary data. So, we feel quite comfortable about the data sets because we think these are quite reliable. And you can see that in Indonesia, the Gini fell quite sharply. It fell quite sharply till the early 1990s, then increased a little bit, but then again it's been falling. Okay, so it's kind of a nice example of how inequality falls and then tends to kind of stagnate a little bit. Same thing in Thailand, pretty much a decrease all the way through in Thailand inequality. Along with that, and both these countries, I should mention, employment shares manufacturing have been increasing steadily over time, right? Chile, again, the periods that we were looking at till the mid-1970s, there was stable or declining inequality, an increase in employment share of manufacturing. And then, of course, there's a much more complicated picture of inequality after the mid-1970s, including even increasing inequality. So again, points here are we have seen examples where inequality has fallen along with structural transformation, not all through the country's history, limited periods. And obviously the question is what happened, at least in these two countries that are from this region, Indonesia and Thailand, right? In these countries. Now, so let's look at the story. So the story we have from the country chapters, country authors chapters, is really a story of a strong focus on rural and agriculture development through public investment, technology, a focus on food price and availability, which acted to constrain to some extent the urban-rural income divergence, and thus the upward pressure in inequality during structural transformation. So again, going back to the Cousinating story, you take workers out of agriculture to manufacturing services. They're moving from poorly paid jobs to better paid jobs. Inequality will always tend to increase. So what do you do to try and stop that? You increase the productivity of agriculture. You increase wages in agriculture. How do you do that? So you essentially focus on rural agriculture development. This may sound counterintuitive. Why is it that for structural transformation manufacturing, are you investing in agriculture? Well, that's the way to try to limit the income divergence between rural areas and urban areas. And that's what Thailand and Indonesia did in the early years. So there was a massive focus on rural and agriculture development, public investment, technology, making sure food prices are not increasing too much and making food available for the poor. All of those things happen in these two countries. Along with that, there was a strong policy focus on primary and later on secondary education expansion, which acted to constrain to some extent. The other problem that happens is that higher skilled workers get more and more higher wages. People with a tertiary education, but those with primary or even no education are obviously having their wages stagnate or even decline. So there's focus on education, primary, then secondary. In Indonesia, we know this very famous example of massive school expansion in the earlier years. So massive school expansion that essentially helped to limit the possible divergence of wages between highly skilled workers and lower skilled workers. So that was also the education, massive expansion education, first primary and then later secondary education. At the same time, a lot of policies which weaken any potential income divergence because of urban-rural incomes and higher skilled, lower skilled workers also follow with that. But there was something else which is also important, which is why this could be a continental story to some extent. There was a lot of jobs created in labor-intensive manufacturing in these two countries, providing many people with high incomes and an equalizing effect, given that movements would likely have been from relatively less equal economic sectors like agriculture or traditional services to a more equal sector, which is labor-intensive manufacturing. So that was the important part of the story. So public investments in rural areas, huge amounts of technology provided, food prices controlled. First point. Second is massive expansion in education. And third point also is that you create jobs in manufacturing and labor-intensive manufacturing. All of these three things together, in our view, can explain this sweet spot that happened in Indonesia and Thailand in the period of 1980 to 1996. I should say that, and we have specialists in Indonesia and Thailand in this audience, that after 1996, that story unraveled. The financial crisis came in 1996. These two countries really suffered in the financial crisis, 1996, and they took a long time to come out of that. And one could argue that never really did come out of that. And that's a discussion we can have later. So this particular story is very much a period-specific story. It's not that these countries always were in the sweet spot. They were not. But when they were there, they were doing things right on the policy side. And there's a different discussion to be had on what happened, what went wrong afterwards, right? So just to go back now, to summarize and provide the main conclusions. So multiple pathways of structural transformation, different inequality dynamics of each. So we see different pathways and we see different kinds of stories on inequality evolving over time. We also can say that rising inequality is not inevitable and policies have made a difference. So that's very important. Policies can and do work in this particular tension, the developer's dilemma. A different policy agenda for broad-based growth is needed for different varieties of structural transformation, and understanding need of inequality impacts of policies for structural transformation and structural transformation impacts inequality addressing policies. But this is important because when we think about structural transformation, we think of one set of policies. Like manufacturing, industrial policies and investment in skills and so on. We think about inequality, we think about a different set of policies. We think about taxes and transfer and so on. We don't think of them like joined up together. And yet the argument you're making is that you've got to think of them as joined up together because they go together, right? Structural transformation and inequality tend to move hand in hand, maybe in different directions, but they certainly are not independent of each other. So you need to think of policies can actually get these two processes, structural transformation on one hand and inequality declining on other together. Because if you don't, then you might actually get your object in one dimension, say structural transformation, but you'll not get the better outcome on inequality in the other dimension. So you've got to think about it joined up. And that's something that hasn't happened in the policy discussion, right? And that's very important point to make here, that we have to think about them in the same way. So just to very quickly, policy implications. So yes, we would like to see more countries in the sweet spot, the bottom right quadrant, the Cousinating Tension. The country experiences growth and structural transformation along with stable or decreasing inequality. Why is it that there's so few countries in that quadrant in our sample of 9 countries? Why is it that has not happened? Public policies remain essential to address the dilemma faced by many developing countries where growth-enhancing structural transformation is often accompanied by rising inequality, as we seem to be seeing right now in China and India and other countries. So we have to think about policy focus on rural and agriculture development. Not necessarily manufacturing or services, but agriculture development. It is not necessarily the case because there is an urban bias often in policymaking in today's world. Through public investment, technology, and so on, with food prices being controlled, making sure there's enough food supply in the country to minimize rural-urban income divergence and make sure the upward pressure inequality is checked. That's very important. And the final thing is just to say that education, of course, matters really, along with access to other public services, including healthcare, housing, social security, which also have been shown to protect against increasing inequality. The Chile case study, which I didn't present, speaks a lot about increasing public service provision. That happened in that period in Chile when there was a stable or declining inequality. So a lot of provision of public services in healthcare, housing, social security, which sadly came to an end in the mid-1970s in Chile. Chile then has faced higher inequality. So that's the messages we hope to make here. And want to say that essentially what we hope to see are more and more countries in the sweet spot, the bottom right part of the quadrant, where policies can really make a difference. I just want to say that we launch a MOOC. Well, actually, we are going to launch a MOOC on 2nd October. MOOC is a massively open online course, in case you're not sure what MOOC stands for, on decent work economic growth, achieving SDG 8. 6-week course aimed to shed light on policy interventions that can support sustainable and equitable economic development while creating opportunities for decent work. Puts together all the work we've been doing the last 5 years, including the developer's dilemma, the work on informality and others. And there is a nice section in this module in this course on the developer's dilemma, which brings together what I presented here from different authors. And so we try to translate the research that we've done into sets of videos and activities especially designed to be useful for policymakers and experts involved with or interested in policy process in the global south. So hopefully also you might want to see the MOOC or be enrolled in the MOOC. And for all of you here, it does provide a very good sense of our work on SDG 8. Yeah, thanks. I'll stop here. So we are now going to move straight on to Hamza. Sorry, Hamza took a bit more time, but I just want to set the stage. So Hamza Ali Malik, I just want to hand it over to him to be the discussant for this overall those findings. Thanks.
Thank you, Kunal. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, Ibu Amida. It's a rare privilege to be presenting ESCAP's work in the presence of the boss. Very nice. Mixed feelings here. Thanks, Kunal, for the opportunity for engaging with the subject again. ESCAP has engaged with the subject a few times since 2016 since I've been joined. We have 3 major publications that have looked into structural transformation directly, dynamics between structural transformation and inequality, role of fiscal policies in addressing inequality and facilitating structural transformation. So I'll be drawing actually from this kind of research, which has been led by colleagues. Some of them are over here already. Oliver is definitely one of them. He has been a lead author of some of these reports. Yusuke Tatano is here. So some colleagues actually will know what I'll be talking about. So I'm not going to talk a lot about what the book is about. Kunal already did a good job. Basically, it explores structural transformation pathways and inequality trends and the tensions between the two. For this, he analyzes the book analyzes 9 case studies. 5 of them are from Asia. Kuznets hypothesis is a framework that is being used. I'll comment on those things for sure. and documents a variety of structural transformation pathways, which emphasizes the role of policies. That's a very important point. I'll dwell on that a little bit more. And in the end, of course, we just heard Kunal drawing some important policy implications. So just for a recap, what structural transformation is all about, it's a change in long-term composition and distribution of economic activities, for essentially low productive activities to high productive activities. Classic Cousinate framework looks only transition from agriculture sector to manufacturing, but the idea can be, of course, applied in general. Whenever there is movement from low productive sectors to high productive sectors or upgrading within the sectors, that's what we call structural transformation. Why it is important? Because it facilitates productivity, which in turn has direct linkages with poverty reduction, inequality, and all those concerns. So just a quick remark on that. So this is a summary, I think I distilled from our 2016 publication, 4 main stylized facts, which I thought will put in place what put it in context what Kunal was essentially highlighting. It's a bit dated. We have data for 2014, but these are long-term trends anyway, so not fundamental changes in shares are going to be most likely. This is for the Asia-Pacific region as a whole, the average numbers. So if you see the agriculture value added in GDP, the contribution of agriculture toward GDP has almost halved between 1990 and 2014. Around 20% to little under 10%, while the share of agriculture in employment did not decline by that much. It has come down a little bit, but not much. That's the point Kunal was indirectly highlighting, that more and more people now are there contributing less in agriculture sector, contributing less to output, which leads to misallocation of labor. And that leads to agriculture productivity gaps, which has implications for wages in the agriculture sector, thus widening the inequality gap between workers working agriculture versus those who have moved on to manufacturing or services. So we document that. In contrast, value added of services, Kunal did not go in the book, does not go in the detail of that too much here. That's one of the ideas I'll be sharing later. Value added of services has increased considerably by a quarter since the 1990s, which is now more than half of the contributions by 2013 data. And the share of employment has also risen by about 60%. So most of the change in Asia Pacific on average has been from agriculture to services, not manufacturing. This is an important point, which I think the book also highlights considerably, because the opportunities of high productive jobs and the higher wages are mostly in the manufacturing sector, which the region seems to be bypassing. And that's the third stylized facts over here. Most countries in the region, and we had a special dedicated report, again led by my esteemed colleague Oliver, countries in special situations, which documents these transformations in countries in special situations and shows that most of them are actually bypassing manufacturing and industrial development. The share of employment in industry, in particular in manufacturing, has stagnated or regressed, exactly resonating what the book highlights as well. The last but not the least, the region is, while it is reindustrializing towards services, this is happening at a much lower level of income. This is a very important point to note. Most countries go through this transition. They initially move from agriculture to manufacturing, but the share of manufacturing tends to be fairly high, at least 25%, and then the transition goes towards servicing or high-tech areas. While those countries who started in the region in 1990s, that had not been the case. Their share of employment in manufacturing has been peaking around 12 to 14%, and they're moving towards services. So they're moving away. Actually, the transformation is happening at a much low level of income. I'll show one graph, I think, that demonstrates that point. So these are the 4 main sort of stylized facts of structural transformation for the Asia-Pacific region as a whole, which ESCAP has explored in detail. Again, I won't share in the details, exactly resonating what the book highlights. These are about 17, 18 case studies we did in our work. So every country follows a different path. That's all you need to see. You don't really need to figure out if you're not keen. You can, of course, read the entire report and figure out. You can look at the China's case, for instance. The horizontal axis actually is the per capita income, and then you have Gini coefficient as market measure of inequality. And you look at Korea, which I highlighted in the morning as well. The green light, I think, is Korea. Right? So the 2 different stark cases over here. Korea's case is very peculiar, at least to me, and we analyzed that in detail. They had the longest period in the region from 1960 to 1996, with substantial 123 time increase in per capita income, with next to zero increase in inequality. That was not a coincidence. There were several policies put in place deliberately to ensure that path. And then something went, as Kunal put it, wrong, or something we need to figure out. He posed a different hypothesis. My hypothesis is a bit different. 1996, 95 tends to be a common point when you see a bit of a divergence between countries' cases. One hypothesis is a pure speculative hypothesis, because a lot of audience, I'm sure, especially UNU-WIDER colleagues, are researchers, so they can investigate this issue formally, is the role of what we call hyperglobalization. When market fundamentalism really took off, a lot of regulations were eased, role of labor unions were sort of dismantled in many countries. That's where the unmanaged capitalism, though, resulted in higher economic growth rate, but at the cost of high inequality. And you see that in many countries across the region, growth continues to happen. However, unlike 60s to 80s or 90s, inequality started to go up. This is something that needs to be investigated formally, I think, future work. So I leave the audience, especially the authors, editors over here, researchers, with 4 ideas to extend the work that has been done. As I think already Kunal did a very good job, this is an important fundamental subject matter for economists, try to understand the processes, how development takes place, and what are the repercussions for other considerations like poverty, inequality, and so on and so forth. So 4 ideas. One, my favorite personal pet issue, I still believe there is a strong reason why the lens tends to be as if the purpose is promoting economic growth at the end of the day. I still disagree. As an economist, this should not be the case. This doesn't have to be the case. This has been the dominant approach to analyze issues, but the consequence is inequality or environment degradation are always take the back burner. So the approach tends to be, let's grow first and then we'll deal with inequality. Let's grow first, and then we'll clear up the environment consequences of this growth. Structural transformation inequality, the way that it has been approached, again, implicitly actually goes into that, assuming, in fact, some ways, that structural transformation has to take precedence. If inequality happens, then yes, we have to institute some policies. What I'm saying is, and there is some initial research that has been done now, what if you bring in inequality in the utility function when you actually, or the priorities of the government, in simple words, before you undertake any transformation? So I'll comment on that a little bit. Extend the Kuznets framework, 2 areas which are not covered directly in the book. One is, as I was alluding to study the tension when transformation takes place from agriculture to services. And that's what ESCAP documents in a report for countries with special situations 2019, I think. A bulk of the transformation has happened this particular way. There is value to analyze it more directly. The focus of this book has been on manufacturing, but looking into services actually has a lot to do. More so keeping in view the very rapid change in digital innovations that is currently going on. So these kind of innovations have happened again and again, and every time, people raise their hands and say, oh, the workers are going to be displaced, the future of work is gloomy, and so on and so forth. And every time the net job creation tends to be higher than the job destruction. And that's why economies over time, last 100 years or so, have progressed. But this time people are putting a question mark in front of this hypothesis instead of a full stop. They're saying, would it be true this time around in the face of artificial intelligence and robotic revolution that the number of jobs destroyed because of that will be more than So this is a question that is worth exploring explicitly and deliberately. So the 2 areas where Cousins' hypothesis can be extended. Third is, I think, and this is a very interesting point the book made and Kunal made in the last slide, interaction between policies you introduce to tackle inequality and policies you introduce to promote or facilitate structural transformation have a bearing on each other. They're not independent. That's the point Kunal made right in the last slide, and correctly so. So it would be helpful, and I'll show one graph, to analyze both measures of inequality, to isolate the effects of policies affecting inequality directly, the redistribution aspects and predistribution aspects, the different set of policies. What the book analyzes is one set of policies, alludes to the implication that there are interactions between policies, but does not analyze in detail yet. And that's something that can be built upon further based on this excellent work in the book. The last one is, again, something Kunal mentioned in the morning in a session, and he mentioned here in the opening remarks also, the distinction between structural transformation and economic transformation. In some sense, structural transformation subject is a bit dated. These are the kind of conversations happening in 80s and 90s. Since the adoption of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, I think primarily we're talking about economic transformation, which is much broader than just structural transformation. So economic transformation, for instance, calls for a transformation of economies that is consistent with the ambitions of the 2030 Agenda in plain words. So energy transition, transport sector transition, and you can start naming all the sectors of the economy that needs to now change in support of the ambitions of the 2030 Agenda. That has not happened. And that part needs to be explored very explicitly here. So very quickly, I'll touch upon each one of these 4 suggestions. In the interest of time, I won't elaborate, but again, question and answer sessions, I'll be happy to explain a bit more and refer to the reports where these things are analyzed in detail. That's what I was referring to, revisiting core assumptions and why it matters. So the 3 things, we by definition, in the mainstream macroeconomics, we by definition rule out distributional considerations. It's such a strong assumption and it bothers me actually as an economist. You don't even give a chance to policymakers to keep distributional considerations as an ultimate objective. It is always considered as an aftermath. Oh, one issue has happened, let's introduce policies now to address that. That can be, or should be checked. When we look at the objective of society, we assume there's a representative agent operating and we can replicate the person's or that representative agent's, whatever that person means, behavior for all people. Assuming, and that's a key word, assuming everybody thinks the same way, everybody behaves the same way, everybody wants the same things. Not true. We know that there is considerable diversity in societies. That needs to be incorporated. There are segments of societies that would rather have relatively less growth, but more equal societies. They rather not have very high paid jobs, but they want to breathe clean air, right? So those aspirations or preferences in the language of economics should be given explicit weight when you want to set up the society's objective function. Last point being, we assume there is agreement on the society's welfare, that everybody wants maximization of material well-being as captured by maximization of GDP growth. When did we have this agreement? When did we have this social contract? I don't think so that is the case. And this is the kind of thinking I think UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development challenges, and if not enough challenges, should challenge even more going forward. Together, these assumptions, this is something we have been very consistently analyzing in an annual publications. It leads to relentless pursuit of self-interest. It gives preference to efficiency at all cost, even if it means distributional implications or messing up the environment and inducing climate change and all that. It promotes unfettered role of markets, so calls for deregulation, the limitation of the role of the state, and so on and so forth. So here are some questions, more research is certainly needed. What kind of society we really want? What do we actually value? There's a very nice book by Mark Carney. It's called Values, the ex-central bank governor, but he's written a massively important book. Essentially, the book's name is Values. There's a plural in the end. And he talks about those things in detail. Again, I won't go. So humans by nature, if you study anthropology, for instance, and there are economists who have studied that also, humans are not essentially meant as part of the behavior, anthropologically speaking, to be self-interested. They essentially work towards common interests always. It's the economists in the last 60, 70 years that have imposed something that is against the human nature, saying, no, we are supposed to be self-interested, and that leads to better outcomes. That needs to be questioned, analyzed, researched, because it has policy implications. So other elements are there. Number 2, extending the Kuznets framework to study services and technology. So this is the last bit. This is a standard Kuznets curve, right? Income per capita inequality. The last bit is something, the dotted line means it's an open-ended question. So would inequality rise again after a certain structural transformation takes place, especially if it happens from agriculture to services? We don't know that. What we're seeing is the pattern. Transformation is happening from agriculture to services, and in services, low productive jobs, informal jobs. So yes, there are hints that inequality is going to go up, but has not been explored, especially if you juxtapose this ongoing, very rapidly evolving artificial intelligence, robotic, digitalization kind of revolution. So this is something I think worth exploring in the overarching questions that have been explored in the book. The motivation factor, this is very clear here. If you look at the potential for manufacturing to create jobs is actually going down. and potential for services to create jobs has increased considerably. So you can see that in the right-hand panel very clearly, both in contribution of GDP growth and contribution to non-agriculture employment growth. The services, the orange bars, look at the right-hand side, is doubled literally between 1990 to 2007 and between then 2008 onwards to 2018. So that's a significant change, transformation that has happened. We are not analyzing, have not studied the consequences of that yet. So I'll explore the researchers from UNU-WIDER to explore that. The third part, the distinction between predistribution and redistribution. So this is something we have been exploring in part and parcel of economic survey every year in some sense, when we think about fiscal policy issues. So blue is the measure of income Gini before taxes and transfers, one of the tools of fiscal measures to try and address inequality. And the red is the change in Gini after these things. So look at the right-hand panel. So the impact of tax and transfers is significant in advanced countries, in high-income countries. This is not the case in a lot of developing countries. The red bars typically are very, very small. The bulk of increase or change or level of inequality actually is before taxes and transfer. So obvious policy implication is, which is analyzed in the book, well, pay attention to the processes that are leading that in the first place, or rather than relying on fiscal policy measures to try and address inequality. This distinction, I think my sense is not clearly understood by policymakers, that largely, like for instance, organizations like Oxfam still like to highlight, let's tax the rich and let's distribute it to the poor as if it's going to solve the problem. I see the logic of that. It's very populist. It will have some impact, but in developing countries, it hasn't had that kind of impact that is expected. There's much more impact likely to happen if you give shape through deliberate policies to the structural transformation process in the first place. That's one of the very important insights of the book, and Kunal made a good job in highlighting it clearly. So here are a few examples that have begun to emerge, and we intend to explore in the next year's survey as well. Governments can, and this is exactly resonates the book's findings, can and should proactively shape structural market forces that determine inequality trend in the first place, not rely too much on fiscal measures to address that. And this green sort of circle shows for some countries that actually is indeed the case. Change in market Gini before taxes is the blue, and that is much more pronounced in some countries. So these country case studies needs to be looked into much more closely to see what is that different they are doing as opposed to countries which are not experiencing the same policies. Some of them, for instance, Kunal mentioned, some of them we document in our research as well, investment in rural development, for instance, or agriculture and skills upgradation and so on and so forth. I'll summarize with those policies. So what are the policy insights? Again, a lot of details in our reports. I'm just highlighting the key messages, which sort of dovetails with the findings of the book. These are the conducive factors, very neatly summarized here. Fast and sustained creation of productive jobs is the ultimate way to tackle with this tension, Cousinating tension. We talked about at length on this issue in the morning session as well. I think this point is not lost on anybody. People to really understand that. So that has to be the focus, deliberate one, not an assumed process that a rising tide will lift all boats, which means a higher rapid growth rate will lead to more job creations automatically. Not always. There are several episodes of jobless growth. So deliberate policy-oriented effort is needed to create jobs. That's the point over here. Investment in access to primary and secondary education. Again, a very common theme in these kind of conversations. Equalize access to infrastructure and essential public services, and investment in rural and agriculture development. The point Kunal also demonstrated very clearly. Harmful factors, things that tends to go not in favor of trying to resolve the tension. Employment concentration in informal and low productivity sectors. Our youth bulge, which can be beneficial, but that is struggling to find decent jobs. And that is happening in some Asia countries now, which creates problems. And market segmentation, other things. A couple of more slides. So this is a summary of broader action, which we highlighted in the last year's survey. So how to give shape to the structural transformation process. Well, the three elements. You can guide, the governments can guide, shape, and then manage the entire process to not let inequality get out of hand in the first place before fiscal measures are introduced to handle them. So structural transformation towards a job-rich path is one. Income distribution, outcomes of the market, that needs to be controlled. Number two is something, I think Kunal didn't mention that in the presentation, but it's in the book, the example of Chile, for instance, a strong role of labor unions or organized labor actually makes a big difference. Same is the case in Korea, where it's one of the spectacular cases. So one lesson, the moment you look into case studies, keeps coming up again and again. You really have to empower the labor essentially in the entire process. There are different ways of doing that, but you can't keep them on the back burner. It creates a lot of problems. So giving shape actually deals a lot with their areas. And then managing the force disruption. That's where Elements Srinivas went out, but his team actually looks into the social protection while they're going through this transition. The population has to be cushioned. I think this is the last one, of one more maybe. So last point, just very briefly, two examples, how we are looking at distinguishing between how we, ESCAP, has moved from structural transformation to economic transformation. So one we have already done, the other we are sort of midway. So example of ESCAP's build forward better policy package and model. So idea is very simple. In the context of COVID, when we were thinking about what kind of policies government countries can use in the context of pandemic, well, we wanted to propose policies that not only help revive economic growth, but help economies recover in a broader sense. Broader sense being the recovery that is consistent with the ambitions of the 2030 agenda. And that's precisely what we did. We developed a macroeconometric model and then demonstrated quantitatively that, yes, indeed, it is possible. The only caveat is we have to have a long-term frame of mind, roughly until 2040 in our approach. So three broad areas: digital access has to be increased, social services, and then green development. Within each sectors, there are considerable details that can be focused on. We have worked with about 12 countries in Asia and the Pacific in altering the model. Thailand, for instance, is working with us on green development aspects. Some countries have asked us to more detail in the social services, and some are asking us to more work with them regarding impact of digital access on enhancing recovery. This is the ongoing one. This I wanted to show. I included it after our morning meeting with Kunal later on. Second example, which we just started working, energy transition. And notice the word just. The just part is something to essentially remain cognizant of the inequalities underlying that can create, the joblessnesses that can be created. This looks pretty straightforward. But if you really pay attention to the literature, and we have tried to figure out when we began research on this topic, the conversation so far has been this in the context of climate change, especially coming from President Trump in US. Very categorical, very clear. Don't go in that direction because it's going to result in lower growth and job losses. So it's not worth pursuing climate change. That's the most clear message over here. So focus on growth, and that has to be the solution. Otherwise, you're going to run into so it has been proposed as a trade-off. What the new research has begun to doing is show it as there are co-benefits to do that. And there are examples of these co-benefits, which has not been sufficiently quantified in a sense, except one working paper that I was able to find by IMF, which are explicitly saying, paying attention on why energy transition is reasonably clearly documented now, that there is no meaningful climate action likely to happen without meaningful transition happening in the energy sector. That's why the focus on energy. So improving or having energy transition improves air quality. It can improve water quality. It has interlinkages with several sustainable development goals. And then hence, if you go in that direction, net job creation might actually be higher than what job losses might take place in this transition, which used to be the argument until very recently. So that's, I will really want UNU-WIDER, because I think Kunal mentioned briefly, UNU-WIDER intends to explore this new developer's dilemma between structural transformation and climate change. I think some of these areas are worth exploring more explicitly, and look forward to that. It is the last word directly for UNU-WIDER. This is my fundamental lesson, having worked with UN. I come from academic background, work as a policymaker in a country level, and now with the UN. Unless and until your research does not reaches the desk of the decision maker, the research is not fun in some sense, other than if you're working in academia that has its own benefits and advantages. So UNU-WIDER should, I think, there is room for more explicit engagement with policymakers. I'm sure you're doing some already, but more explicit one using UN's existing platforms. For instance, when I visit ECOSOC forum discussions in New York, UNU-WIDER is normally not there in those conversations. A lot of intergovernmental processes over here in ASCAP, for instance, UNU-WIDER is not typically there. But UNU-WIDER actually has a lot of insights to offer, because they do very systematic, very sustained research for several years. So their research or ideas or policy implications are very reliable. So we offer you collaboration with regional economic commissions in making sure your research reaches the right desk for decision makers. Thank you once again for the opportunity to engage or re-engage with this topic. These are 3 reports that I was referring to where I've drawn my comments. So those who are interested can, of course, go online and have a look at the details of what we have done in this area. Thanks a lot.
So actually, Hamza made very, very interesting observation. I was almost tempted to respond, but I think I will hold off to the Q&A, Hamza, and we can discuss some of your observations, which I think were very, very, very useful, actually, because I think we should now move on to the country presentations very quickly. I'll introduce the 2 speakers, then they can come and speak, and, we can move, and then we'll go to so the first will be the Thailand case study, Walirath Supanachat, and as a presenter, and followed by Achandan Kopaibuan as a discussant, and we have Peter Wall online also. You might join in. We'll see. So Walirath, over to you, and then Achandan can come in and provide you discussion comments. Yeah.
Good afternoon, all. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm Walirath Supanachat from Kasetsart University. Today, I will be presenting a brief summary of Thailand case study, which is in the 5th chapter of this book, The Developer's Dilemma. And the title of this chapter is Benign Growth, Structural Transformation, and Inclusive Growth in Thailand. The main author of this chapter is Professor Peter Wall, who is joining online right now. Okay, here is an outline of my presentation. I will first introduce a brief background on the Thai economy and then explain the study's main purpose. Next, I will discuss significant structural changes that took place in Thailand. I will then explain the connection between structural change and inclusive growth in terms of poverty and inequality reduction. And finally, I will conclude by summarizing the main findings and their implications. First of all, in the case of Thailand, the economy has undergone a radical transformation with agricultural employment and GDP shares contracting over time. And the rate of this structural change has been strongly correlated with the overall rate of economic growth. The faster the growth, the more rapid the structural change. However, whether these structural changes are inclusive or not remains a question. Therefore, the main purpose of this study is to analyze the economic growth and structural change in Thailand and examine whether these factors have led to increased inequality. To examine growth and structural change, this study divided the Thai economy into 4 periods based on the average growth rate of real GDP. And the first period is called the pre-boom, covering the years prior to 1987. The second period is the boom period during 1987 to 96. The third period is the Asian financial crisis. And the fourth period is called the post-crisis, covering the year after 2000 onwards. And yet, as you can see from this graph, that in overall, the long-term growth in the Thai economy is quite impressive. During 1951 to 2017, the real GDP per person in Thailand grew at an average annual rate of 4%. And the real income per person in 2017 was 13 times higher than that in 1951. The primary source of this growth has been the expansion of physical capital, accounting for over half of the output growth. Other sources of growth include human capital, raw labor, and total factor productivity, or TFP. Regarding the structural transformation, Thailand exhibits typical features of middle-income economies, in which the share of agricultural employment far exceeds its share of GDP. However, there are 2 interesting points to note about the structural change in Thailand. Firstly, the movement of labor has primarily been from the agricultural sector to services, with a lesser extent of movement into industrial activities. Secondly, the movement of physical capital has primarily been directed toward the industry, especially the export-oriented manufacturing. And this graph shows the characteristic of structural change in terms of output or GDP shares. As you can see that the declining GDP shares of agriculture was mirrored by an expansion of manufacturing share, with that of services changed much more moderately. In 1960, the agricultural GDP share was about 34%, and it had declined constantly to 8% in 2017. And for the latest figure in 2021, it's about 6% of total GDP. In contrast, the manufacturing GDP share had risen from 13% to 34%, while services GDP share remained roughly unchanged at about 46%. Nevertheless, services still account for the largest share of total GDP in Thailand. In terms of employment, the declining employment share of agriculture was mirrored by an expansion of services. This is largely due to the fact that the Thai manufacturing is so much more capital intensive. This study also did some quantitative analysis and revealed that during 1981 to 2017, the industrial sector absorbed about 35% of the workers released from agriculture, and services absorb the remaining 65% of the workers. And when comparing the output share with the employment share, the small table here confirms that the share of agricultural employment far exceeds its share of GDP. And this disparity has increased over time. This implies that income within agriculture was far below those employed elsewhere. And this slide illustrates the impact of structural change on aggregate productivity. This is done by decomposing the growth of aggregate labor productivity into within sector productivity and between sector productivity. The within sector productivity refers to the productivity growth within each sector, namely agriculture, industry, and services. The between sector productivity refers to the movement of labor from lower productivity sectors to higher productivity ones, and this is called structural change. As you can see from this horizontal bar chart, the structural change had contributed to labor productivity growth in all periods, and it also accounts for over half of the aggregate productivity growth over the entire period from 1960 to 2017. Now let's move on to the last topic, which examines the connection between structural change and inclusive growth. And in this context, inclusive growth encompasses both poverty reduction and income inequality reduction. Over the long term, structural change in Thailand has coincided with significant reductions in poverty incidence and moderate reductions in income inequality. The economic policies that have contributed to structural change include infrastructure development, such as the construction of rural roads and other transport facilities linking various parts of Thailand, as well as the public policies that facilitate the relocation of workers, such as the BOI's investment promotion and export-oriented manufacturing policies. Regarding the Cousinating Tension, which refers to the coexistence of high rate of structural change and increased level of inequality, the Thai data do not support such a relationship either in the long term or the medium term. And this slide here confirms that over the long term, both poverty incidence and income inequality in Thailand exhibit declining trends. The poverty incidence has declined throughout the study period. And so if the inclusive growth is defined as growth that reduces poverty, then structural change is definitely inclusive. And the impact of structural change on inequality also depends on the poverty lines used in calculating the poverty incidence. Regarding income inequality, over the medium term, the Gini coefficients initially increase and then decline. So the Thai data support the Kuznets hypothesis of an inverted U-shaped relationship between average income and inequality. But if we look into the long term throughout the study period from 1962 to 2017, the Gini coefficient exhibit declining trend. However, when looking at the regional level, the income inequality in Thailand is more of a concern. These two figures here summarize the data on inequality within and between regions. The first figure on the left-hand side shows that the Gini coefficient has not changed markedly within regions. In fact, the Gini coefficient has remained roughly unchanged, hovering around the range of 0.4 to 0.5 over the course of 3 decades. The second figure emphasizes the income inequality between regions. The important point is the persistence of high levels of inequality between regions since 1986, with Bangkok Metropolitan Region or BMR being the wealthiest, followed by the central and southern regions, while the north and northeast were lag behind and has not made substantial progress in catching up. And this slide tries to wrap up or answer the main research question of this book that categorize the relationship between the growth enhancing structural change and the level of inequality. And so we call the patterns of Cousinating tension. In the Thailand experience appears to be weak and somewhat ambiguous. While the structural change initially led to rising inequality, there was a decline in inequality after 1992. So when we consider the whole period from 1981 to 2017, the Cousinating tension in the case of Thailand was characterized as weak or benign. In conclusion, structural change in Thailand has played a significant role to contribute to productivity growth. And this is primarily driven by the movement of relatively unskilled labor from lower productivity rural employment to more productive urban employment in industry and services. The Thai data support the Cousinating hypothesis of an inverted U-shaped relationship between average income and inequality. However, there is no long-term Cousinating tension between the rate of structural change and the level of inequality. In other words, the growth and structural change did not raise inequality in the case of Thailand. And hence this growth is called benign growth in the sense that it did not cause serious problems in terms of inequality. Nevertheless, it is important to note that the level of inequality remained high throughout the study period and continues to be a pressing issue in Thailand. Finally, the study underscores the importance of addressing regional disparities through a comprehensive nationwide education reform. Without such reform, Thailand may struggle to transition up the value chain from being a middle-income producer of unskilled and semi-skilled labor-intensive products to becoming a high-income innovative producer of skill-intensive products. And that's the end of my presentation, and maybe Professor Peter Wong may like to add something or address some question afterwards. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Valirat. Peter War here. I will come in only after we've had the comments from Ajahn Achanan. I'll come in there. Thank you. Bye.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the organizer very much to inviting me for this event, especially Professor Kunasen. Hi, Peter. Okay, it's a very great honor to discuss this paper. I think what I'm trying to do is I try to highlight something about this chapter because it is already finished, and I try to give some thought that what would be the next step, what something is very more interesting for the future work. Okay, about this chapter, I think that the chapter tries to illustrate the interlink between growth, structural transformation, poverty reduction, and inequality using data from Thailand during 81 to 2017. This is a part of a comparative study, which I mean you have to compare with the other chapters, so it has to be in line, not to be imbalance between the chapter as well. So I think that it's very, very good chapter. It's highly recommended to read for someone who interested in economic development and those interested in Thailand. Okay, I think one thing that I want to raise here is in the chapter, let's divide the whole period into four. The share of the export service increase, but other than that, we don't export a lot of other service, other non-tourism service, but we still export a lot of goods. And then the market or the degree of openness decrease. What would happen to the structural adjustment? That would be the interesting question to me, at least. And the final point, this is a degree of openness for the ASEAN country and as well and China as well. You can see that the degree of openness only Thailand and Malaysia have keep declining and persistently throughout 2010 onward. But the other, Vietnam is keep increasing. That there's a question about the structural adjustment. What's happening in Thailand? Is it because of the uncertainty that stall industrialization process and the service is keep going as it is usual, or what? Right? That is I think this is a point that I would encourage Peter and Maria to further divide, to dig deep to decompose the last period, because from 2000 to 2017. There's many things going on, and that would explain a lot why growth in Thailand are really we slow down. We haven't fully recovered from the Asian financial crisis yet. That's all for mine. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Walirat and Achinun, both for the presentation and for the very, very insightful comments on Thailand's more recent growth experience. So now we're moving on to Indonesia, and we have two presenters, one online. So we're supposed to have Professor Arif Yusuf present Indonesia case study, but he unfortunately could not make it. So we have, thankfully, Professor Andy Sumner of the King's College London joining us virtually, so that we have a presentation on Indonesia, and then we have the discussion. Dr. Titik Anand, so Ministry of Advisor to the Ministry of Finance, to also comment on the Indonesia chapter. So I think Andy Sumner should be online. And Andy, if you are online, could you make your presentation? Yeah, good. Thanks. We can hear you, and we can also see.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present the chapter. So I'm presenting the chapter for myself and the co-authors. In some ways, some of what I've said will resonate with previous discussions. Other facts may be additional. So this is the Indonesia chapter. I'll say a little bit about the developer's dilemma and the Indonesia story and experience, what Indonesia teaches us about navigating the dilemma, and also say a little bit about what I think Indonesia tells us about something that Arthur Lewis talked about in terms of trickle along economic policy. Next slide, please. So I think there's three key points. The first is to reiterate the point made earlier that there are multiple pathways of economic development. We can see that Indonesia experienced the sweet spot in terms of upgrading industrialization prior to the 1990s and prior to the Asian financial crisis. And then since then, at least in the period we're covering, there's a kind of stalled industrialization, which may have tipped over into deindustrialization in employment during periods after the Asian crisis. The second point is, I think Indonesia demonstrates that rising inequality is not inevitable. So exactly as Cousinating said, public policy makes a difference. And I think Indonesia shows that very well. And then finally, I'm going to present an idea drawing from Arthur Lewis that Indonesia is an exemplar of trickle-along economics. This idea of addressing income divergences between sectors, not just economic sectors, but thinking of sectors more broadly. Next slide, please. So first of all, just a quick word on Kuznets and Lewis. I'll skip through this. Actually, I think some of it's been covered, certainly on the Kuznets side. So as Kunal mentioned, the book really focuses on these two big goals and a tension between them in terms of their impact on inequality. A point first flagged by Kuznets. So what we need to do, or what we're thinking for the chapter, was what does Indonesia tell us about navigating the dilemma successfully, and how does this fit with this idea of trickle-along economic policy? Next slide, please. So just saying a bit about Arthur Lewis, because we've covered Kuznets earlier on in the presentations. In a way, Lewis has a somewhat comparable model of rising inequality because the labour shares are squeezed as a result of economic development, and that implies rising individual inequality. The correlation between the two empirically is clear enough. So there's an upswing. Development does not start everywhere at the same time, as Lewis famously said. Capital shares drive development, which implies squeezing labour shares. And then they have a sort of downswing theory in the same way you have with Kuznets. The Lewis turning point's reached, surplus labour is exhausted, wages rise, and the functional distribution of income moves in favour of labour. So I think you have a kind of, in a way, I mean, of course, Lewis and Kuznets were contemporaries, but actually I think Lewis brings a considerable additional angle to the debate. Next slide, please. So what did Lewis mean by trickle-along economics? Of course, everyone, trickle-down economics is very well known. Principally, Lewis was talking about, if you think about rising inequality overall, in the same way Kuznets spoke, you can actually break that down. So Lewis talked about rising inequality between sectors and within sectors. So, of course, as Kuznets wrote, you have urban and rural sectors. Lewis wrote about modern traditional sectors. You also have skilled and unskilled workers, or low education and medium high education. So policies that focus on sectoral divergence are important to address the developer's dilemma. The modern sector can benefit the traditional sector, but the government really has to do something and be active in this space in order for that to happen. It's not like trickle-down economics. It actually requires intervention. So next slide, please. So I'll say a bit about the Indonesia story. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned briefly at the outset, Indonesia, for much of the period under study, really has incredibly success. It's a success story in terms of structural transformation. The country experienced upgrading industrialization, rising employment shares, rising value-added shares in manufacturing from the mid-70s through to the Asian financial crisis. And then since then, it's been rather a different story of deindustrialization and very rapid tertiarization, which may in some part be an important part of the story of rising inequality post-Asian financial crisis, I think. Next slide. So if we look back over the time period we're interested in, what we see is this period of sort of falling inequality in the 70s, and very, very, very flat, more or less flat inequality, certainly around the sort of mid 80s to mid 90s, and then well-known rapid rise in inequality since the Asian financial crisis. And actually, we try and link those patterns of inequality back to structural transformation, and with a focus also on predistribution, I think, as well as of the event distribution. So next slide. So when it comes to characterizing Indonesia, I think we can certainly say that growth-enhancing structural transformation was achieved with stable or declining, actually stable inequality for most of the period, from 1975 to 96, which is quite an incredible story when you think that's so 20 years of rapid structural transformation with largely steady inequality. So clearly Indonesia is an important case study because it tells us something about how this could be achieved. But then since the Asian financial crisis, there's been weak, almost the opposite pattern of in terms of desirability, weak structural transformation and increasing inequality. So how's this been achieved? Next slide, please. So in the chapter, we discuss what happened and then how did it happen. And in terms of what happened and how did it happen, there was clearly a very favorable move in exchange rates and then a burgeoning export-orientated boom, generating a very large number of labor-intensive manufacturing jobs. And clearly, this is very much part of the story of spreading the benefits of inequality, spreading the benefits of economic development. At the same time, the government used a very proactive rural development policy, education provision, pro-post spending to address inequality in a way, as Lewis intended, trying to deal with some of the divergences between sectors. And concurrently implemented these so that at the same time of promoting structural transformation, there was an attention to inequality as well. Next slide. So I think there's three things to draw out which resonate with some of the earlier presentations. There was a very strong focus, which seems counterintuitive, on rural and agricultural development. So when Lewis talks about attacking the problems of the traditional sector directly with government policy, this is clearly something that was very much on the minds of Indonesian policymakers. Extensive public investment, rural employment programs, rural development, cheap and stable foodstuffs, a very strong focus on the more traditional part of the economy, as the other part, the modern sector, was clearly really expanding and booming. Secondly, there was, again, somewhat counterintuitively, there was a strong focus, I think, on the predistribution in terms of education. So there was little in the way of immediate redistribution programs like cash transfers as there are now, or social protection type provision programs are more concerned with sort of the immediate social welfare. And a much stronger focus, as Kunal said, Indonesia is famous for the expanding primary education and public investments in education during the 1970s and 1990s. And then finally, this very strong focus on widespread employment growth. So productivity growth was translated into employment growth and that became a very sort of dominant force, really spreading very widely the benefits of economic development. So next slide. So I think that in terms of what does Indonesia teach us, I think there's three conclusions. Four conclusions. The first, I think it's clear that structural transformation tends to generate distribution tensions because, as Lewis pointed out, spatially, some parts of a country benefit before others. Some workers in countries benefit before others. And so it requires a kind of, in a way, a sort of counterintuitive measures to some extent in the very activist government policy in terms of rural and agricultural development, very large public investments that address the kind of constraint to constrain the urban and rural income divergence. And so when Lewis talks about trickle along, it's really that trickle along from urban to rural or modern to traditional sectors. And then secondly, this redistribution of the near future, essentially redistributing people's children's income rather than their income. So very large investments in public education that constrain the skilled, unskilled worker divergence. Again, thinking about sectors and Lewis's trickle along from skilled workers to unskilled workers. And then finally, this very strong focus on employment growth and employment generation rather than large real wage rises as a consequence of productivity growth. So that brings me to the final slide, and then I'll say a little bit about the future. So for Lewis, the notion of development and addressing the dilemma as Lewis saw it, it's somewhat similar or resonating with Cousinating To tax the developed sectors and subsidize the underdeveloped sectors is one of the most powerful ways governments can use to ensure the benefits of development are spread broadly. The moral for policymakers is not to rely on trickle down to benefit the traditional sector, but to attack the problems of that sector directly. So I think when we sort of think about the developer's dilemma in Indonesia, we can say that for a period of time, perhaps 20 years, Indonesia was very successful in achieving both structural transformation and relatively stable inequality. And so in a way that makes Indonesia a very important case study for thinking about policies. We can say since the Asian financial crisis, we can see a very rapid rise in tertiary employment and in a much weaker or stalled industrialization and deindustrialization. And rising inequality, although up to more recent years, and sort of introduction of social policy programs to try and to address that. And I think looking ahead, I think one of the challenges is that the kind of policies that were very successful and expanding education, they reach a kind of point where addressing the skilled unskilled worker divergence becomes harder. Indonesia's urban-rural population, more of the population is urban now, so the kind of there's diminishing benefits of those kind of addressing those divergences. And of course, Indonesia developed in a world where China was pretty much asleep, and now most many developing countries are trying to enter global value chains at similar entry points, and there's much more fierce competition around those entry points. And also, of course, technology has moved on, so the number of jobs created in textiles, electronics is fewer than it was during the sort of 70s and 80s. And so I think looking ahead, developing countries face another set of questions in terms of a changing context, not least around how to sustain industrialization, bigger questions about how to make that transition to green industrialization too, but also how to generate a large number of jobs from the sectors that perhaps are less likely to in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sumner, for the very excellent presentation of the chapter. First of all, I would like to congratulate all the researchers involved in the book to make the book open for public. The book, I read most of it, and I found it is very important and relevant, especially for policy makers, but of course for wider audience it's also going to be very important. Secondly, I sincerely appreciate the UNU-WIDER and ESCAP to invite me to provide comments on this chapter. So I think I will start from the last bit that Professor Sumner quoted, and the challenge for Indonesia regarding the stall industrialization in Indonesia. I think I found the chapter is is very encouraging, and then ended with some worrying trend. Maybe I pick up what is left from the book. So I would like to share a bit what happens in Indonesia after 2014. So maybe we start with the first slide. So basically, the inclusivity is part of our constitution, so it has to be delivered basically. But as the book already highlighted, it's not always easy task. So there's always a dilemma between structural transformation and inclusivity itself. So probably we go to the first slide. Oh, I should do it myself, I guess. Yes, right. So the authors the time frame of their study is up to 2014. We see that after 2014, the manufacturing in Indonesia is still growing slower than the overall GDP. So we have that kind of slowing down manufacturing up until now. And the COVID-19 make it even worse. Not only the manufacturing slowing down, but the economy also slowing down. But what happened post 2014? Given our manufacturing is slowing down, but the equality has to be addressed as well, remain to be one of the objectives. So what happened post 2014? So if we look at from the fiscal perspective, our budget is quite a big portion allocated for ensuring access to everyone. For example, there are 4 main elements of the budget allocated to ensure access to people. The first, on education. By constitution, since 20% of the budget has to be for education. However, the challenge is because the budget is designed based on certain kind of assumption. Along the way, it's going to be changed. Then it means that the budget for current year can be changed as well. So the challenge will be if you change the assumption, the allocated 20% is going to be changed. It's not easy to reallocate the spending to make it effective and efficient. So the government created what it's called the National Education Development Fund in 2010. So some portion of the education allocated budget is relocated to this fund. We call it's managed by what we call the LPDP. So currently it manages around 139 trillion rupiah, around 90 billion US dollar, I guess, yeah. So this, 10 billion US dollar, I guess, yeah. So this Education Development Fund is allocated for scholarship for Indonesian to study either in Indonesia or overseas, merit-based initially, but later on during the day, over time, it is also has some kind of affirmative parts of the scholarship to give access, as Professor Sumner mentioned earlier, to give access to those have either from a certain income group, the poor, for example, or certain region in the country. And also, the government experiments what is called Campus Merdeka and Belajar Merdeka program to increase the human resources capacity, both in university level and elementary and also high school level. The second part of the budget is also allocated quite big amount is on health reform and also access for health service for everyone. So we have support for the bottom 20% of the income group support for the health insurance by the government. The third part of the fiscal to allow protection for the bottom 20% is social protection. It targets certain group of the population. The last but not least is the Infrastructure Development Fund. As you know, Indonesia is a country with inadequate infrastructure. So since 2014, the government allocated large amount of fund to develop the infrastructure so the gap can be reduced. The next part of my presentation, just some highlights how big the funding is allocated to those. In education, for example, 20% of the national budget, and the amount increased over time. And for the health also increased. And during the COVID period, we have certain allocation of a fund for the COVID management, the yellow one. And we have a big issue of stunting in the country. So we have allocated certain fund for stunting prevention acceleration. And for social protection budget, we also have large allocation. I think it's about 500 trillion, so close to the budget for education, actually. It is targeted. How is it targeted? Target certain part of the population, for example, the disability, elderly, a household with pregnant women, household with small children, scholarship for young people in education from poor family, and also some not only for elementary or high school scholarship, but also at university level. And the health insurance is covered by the government for the people that has the criteria or meet the criteria. The government also provide food assistance. This is probably in line what the Professor Sumner mentioned, that the government wants to ensure the access to food is warranted. So although the price is increased, for example, but the household with low income can still access the food through the food assistance. And extreme poverty going to be also the important element of the social policy in Indonesia. So as Professor Sumner mentioned earlier, we have increased Gini ratio up to 2014. But if you see at the graph at the below, the trend up to 2019 is declining. However, COVID makes the inequality also going to be a challenge again for not only Indonesia, I guess, but for many countries. And it has been persistent that we see in 2013. The trend is a bit increasing. And for the budget for infrastructure is also double in 2014, almost double in 2014, and keep on increasing later on. And on the sectoral policy, as Professor Sumner mentioned earlier, attack the root of the problem of the sector. I think that's the main message that he quoted in the end of the presentation. So I think the issue with the Indonesian agriculture sector, probably also in other country, is lack or low productivity. I think the issue is how to increase the productivity of our agriculture sector. And as you see on my slide earlier, the manufacturing growth is lower than the average GDP growth. So where our growth comes from, it's not from agriculture, but from some of the services sector, such as transport and communication, construction. And I see earlier the presentation that distinguish between modern services and traditional services. In Indonesia, traditional services is characterized by low productivity, while modern sector or modern services sector is the one that produce higher value added and high productivity. However, the share of these modern services is not that yet high in Indonesia. So the homework is how to modernize our traditional services so that it can be the driver for a better equality among Indonesia. I think I stopped there my presentation. Thank you once again for the opportunity.
Again, we had a fascinating story about Indonesia from Andi Sumner, but also what is happening more recently, especially on the pro-equity type bias of policies, which is also very interesting, learning from the Indonesian recent years. So what I would like to now review, about 20 minutes or so, because we started a bit late for Q&A, I suggest the presenters and the discussants who are here in person, of course, to come in front here. That's Valirat, Achanun, Hamza, Titik. If you could come over right here, and I'll be there too. And then we'll try and take some questions from the floor. Actually, Andi Sumner and Peter Ward, they're online, so they can also answer questions virtually. So that's not a problem. Right. Thanks, Anand. There were quite a few questions from the discussants, but I feel for want of time, maybe we should start with the audience here and online, and then maybe at some point, Valirat and Andy and I also might respond to some of the comments from the discussants because they were really very insightful. So let's take some questions, maybe for the first in-person audience, and then hopefully we'll get some from the online audience. I don't know who's is it Ruby? Are you checking that? Okay, good. And of course, Andy and Peter, if you're listening, you can chip in on the responses at any point. Just let us know. Okay. So questions from the in-person audience here to start off. What did you take from this, from the developer's dilemma experience, especially for Indonesia and Thailand? And what do you think it implies for the future? I think one takeaway I had listening to Hamza and to Andy at the end, that the sweet spot doesn't look likely for many countries now. In other words, historically, the period that we saw in Indonesia, Thailand, even for those two countries, as we heard from Titik, I mean from Achanun particularly, is already a challenge. And then we have the climate challenge, so a triple dilemma now. And so it's, I mean, I kind of felt that maybe one important question we could discuss, is it likely that we will see more of the examples we had for Indonesia and Thailand for that particular period of 20 years or so to the mid-90s at all for the future in this region? So that's just a question that is bothering me right now, actually. So yeah, any questions? Oliver, you look ready to ask a question. Go ahead. Sure. You want a mic? Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much, Kunal. Yeah, I mean, in a way, I was thinking, we heard a lot about those countries or some countries here in the region that have already reached higher middle income levels, Thailand, Indonesia, and that have already been able to develop a significant manufacturing sector. Although we talked about the kind of deindustrialization. My concern is because I'm working for a section where we look at the least developed countries, the landlocked and the SID, small island developing states. And I'm thinking of the LDCs, least developed countries, how they're in a kind of much worse situation, aren't they? Because will they be actually even able to develop a manufacturing sector and follow in the footsteps of Thailand and Indonesia? That's very questionable, I think, now, isn't it? Especially with everything that is coming up with automation, artificial intelligence. So whereas, maybe a few years ago, some of them, Bangladesh, Cambodia, were able to develop manufacturing sectors. Will the others be able to do that and copy that in a way? And I think that's kind of very worrying. And that's what we saw in our report, this move from agriculture to low productivity services sector. So while we didn't really talk about the middle income trap. Is that something that maybe Indonesia and Thailand are looking at? But is that even a trap that some of the countries in special situations that we refer to, are they even going to be able to get there, or what challenges will they be facing? And then, of course, we had the discussion. We haven't really. You talked this morning a little about needing to differentiate between service sectors. What kind of service sectors do you have? Do you have low productivity service sectors or high productivity service sectors? And we mentioned also technical innovation there, or digitalization. But is that a solution for many of these countries in special situations? What I'm particularly concerned about. Philippines has been able to create call centers. Is that a sustainable model? Is that a model that other countries will be able to emulate, or will it just be a move from higher wage countries such as Philippines to some of the lower wage countries that we have in the region that maybe do have the language skills or the technology to do that? So these are some of the challenges that I'm coming up with, and I did put a lot out there, but maybe these are some issues that I'd like to hear your thinking on these issues from you and from the panelists. Thanks.
Thanks, Oliver. Let's take, maybe if you can take one, or Ruby had an online question. Yeah, go ahead.
Very much following on from what Oliver also asked, we've got a question online just asking about any specific takeaways for Bangladesh compared to other countries in the region, and I think also reflecting on the LDC sort of question there. And then another one on services also, as what do we think is the potential for the services, also given the challenge of AI possibly taking some of these services such as call centers, etc., taking on some of these roles as well going forward. So,
okay, thanks, Ruby. Thanks for the question. That was a very interesting question for Bangladesh. So, any further questions? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay, go
on. Mine is a little bit more of a methodological question, but like how could the data or the findings change if you use a different measure of inequality, such as the Palmer ratio or something? And also if you start looking at different sections of society, like I remember reading a lot about how countries can grow, but like from a gender perspective, actually women are more disadvantaged in these cases, or the informal sector, etc. So just if there's been any look into that.
Thank you. So I think what I suggest is, and this is why this is a panel and not just the presenter, the country authors responding to discussants, we could have a more open discussion, because I think the question, especially on Oliver's question about small island economies, question on Bangladesh, are more generic questions about the region, right? And so I think these are a question, then the question of methodology also comes in. So I was wondering, Amza, actually, I know that you and Oliver worked very closely together. So try to give a step outside your, outside the ESCAP role in a sense, think about what would you take from the work that we've done on smaller island economies, because in this book we don't cover those kind of countries. What is the dilemma for them? And do you see, as Oliver is asking, what exactly are the prospects for growth in those countries? So I'll start with you specifically, because I think it's a really important question for ESCAP, isn't it? And I think that's really something we should think about outside the large emerging economies like China, India, and Indians and Indonesia and so on. So do you want to just have a couple of
Yeah, let me try. Certainly a very important, very difficult, and yet pertinent question. Let me think on the lines of, for instance, there is a phrase we use deliberately in our work, drawing from the library of experiences. And this is what we saw today. Every country has a different pathway to structural transformation. There is no one way to go about doing things. So when we use this term, use this phrase, library of experiences, we are essentially saying, well, you don't have to replicate what Korea did or what China is doing or Bangladesh is doing right now, but look carefully at the elements that they have put in place at different points in time, different sets of policies together to address structural transformation and inequality, and then try and apply to your own circumstances. That was kind of our message. So small islands, developing states, for instance, their circumstances are fundamentally different. They're remote, not very connected. They have much more, I think Oliver and team did a work on how to leverage oceans-related economy. So they have to focus much more on fisheries, for instance, or tourism, for instance, which other countries do not need to focus on. But how to go about doing that, you can draw lessons from other countries. Investment in skills, for instance, right? Paying attention to certain within sector changes that are taking place, and then investments by the government to facilitate that through industrial policies. That can be another example. The other element is something I think we need to think is one contributing factor to the rise of Asia or a spectacular growth. Many examples that we saw today has been it became a factory of the world in some way, manufacturing-led growth, right? But lately, because of revolution in technology, there has been an element of reshoring happening. Wages have risen considerably because employment share in manufacturing have increased in many countries. So it's becoming expensive for advanced countries of Europe and US to open factories here and then make them produce something and then go over there. So there's a reshoring happening already, reasonably documented in many instances. What has changed in that context now is there is a very strong regional or global value chain that is set up. So China, for instance, has moved to a higher value sectors, but the thing that China was doing maybe 20 years ago has been picked up by Vietnam and Philippines and small circuit semiconductors, these kind of areas which China was doing 20 years ago, but other countries have picked up and then supplying those products to China. So they have risen in some sense, or benefited from the rise of China going forward, right? So these are kind of things that can be done for the services sector, for instance, now. Strengthening relationship, because services can be delivered, as we noted in the morning, are not physical. You don't have to set up a factory for that. You need to invest in maybe a digital infrastructure that allows you to engage, and then you can engage anywhere in the world in some ways. India, to some extent, has done that in some ways. So the focusing on the services sector and then deliberately linking with the regional value chains can be one modality for small island developing states or other developing countries, while trying to pay close attention to policies that worked. And when I say policies that work in the sense that allowed you for the transitions, structural transformations, they were helpful, but not led to increase in inequalities, like investment in rural sectors, skill upgradation, and those kind of other areas that I also highlighted, and the book also highlights many of those areas. Some of the initial reactions, I guess.
Thank you. That's very useful. I would actually now ask the Thai case study is interesting, and it was really amazing to hear what Ajani made up at the last period that in the book chapter, because the question I would have, and this is for Valirat and Ajani actually and Peter online, that Thailand had its great, amazing period of growth and social transformation with fairly stable inequality, but that's not petered out. And this last period is showing, as you're making the argument, that it's not obvious now, because the graph that you showed on openness is quite remarkable for a country so open that there's been declining trend openness, and of course the question of political uncertainty in the country. So, what is the future for Thailand? I mean, the high income goal of being the high income country has been there for a long time, but it hasn't really been achieved, right? And it's still a situation where they're not able to move it up more high level, higher value manufacturing, right? So I was curious to hear that, and maybe Peter can also come in on the periodization, because that was a really important point, that maybe the periodization of 2017, I think, is somewhat problematic. So I wanted to hear Valirat and Peter's response to this. So maybe, Arjun, you can think a bit more now, looking forward, like what is the future for Thailand in terms of the fact that the best years are kind of used to be after the crisis, financial crisis. And when do you think Thailand can make this move to a high income status? And is it in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? When do you think that might happen? And then I want to move to Balirat and Peter on the periodization itself. So Archana, over to you.
Thank you. I think that I would like to begin with the structural transformation. Sorry, I have to wear a mask because I still have a flu, so I don't want to spread. I'm okay. I think that the differences between low income and middle income is the opportunity cost for structural transformation for low income is quite low. I mean, you move someone from low productive sector like rural, urban, subsistence, agriculture, you move them away to more productive, either service or manufacturing, simple manufacturing. That is a productivity improvement. You make people richer. That's quite straightforward. So you have to look at whether what is the opportunity for them to be done. It's vary from country to country. As you said, you cannot be copy, cut and paste from other country to say, okay, this country doing like this and get rich, so you follow their suit. No, you cannot do that. You just, okay, you move people, and that is the simple things about the low income country. But when it comes to be middle income like Thailand, I think it's really complicated because we don't know. We don't have any clear what would be the next one. There are so many options available. Mm-hmm. For me, people say Thailand still be a SMB, low wage assembly. I say no. Thailand is really complicated, high precision assembly. If you look at some manufacturing sector, like air conditioning, we are number 2 in the world. Market share is about 20%. This is still ongoing. Not the solid state, the traditional one. And when you think about the 5G technology, the cloud computing coming, the traditional hard disk is still on demand. It's not going to be disrupt like what we expect. So, in my sense, Thailand, we don't actually know, but what we experience in 2006 is really high uncertainty. When you have a high uncertainty, people always come to the mode, wait and see until uncertainty was resolved. And that is happening to me. And I think that is very important. That's why if you look at the structural transformation pathway, I thinking that we are trapped in the middle, store industrialization. We wait and see what is going on. The spotty day are going to really end. If you don't know what I mean, Thailand pay spotty days in 2006. Yellow, red, green, whatever color. You don't have any color left for you to be neutral. But I think that is a problem to Thailand. Mm-hmm. And I think that I hope that if the uncertainty has been resolved, we can move forward. We can move forward, right? So right now we stuck in the middle. We don't really want to move because of when you reach the income level, you need to invest. Invest means put the money today and get the benefit in the next few years, which is usually longer than the politician period. Parliament is a 4-year period. So if you put the education and you need to wait longer time, that is a conflict we are facing. And we hope that if we have a clear understanding, we have a more like the work that Kuna and other did, provide more insight what really happened, that would help us to get a clearer vision of what should we do. I think that it's hard to say Thailand when Thailand will become a high income country, but actually we just become an upper middle income in 2011 or 14, just 10 years ago, or 10, 20, 15 years ago. Is it too late, or we are impatient to be the middle, to be high income? I don't know, but I think that that is, for me, is happening. And actually, another one point I want to add is, for country which use manufacturing as a sector to drive economy, especially export-led manufacturing like Thailand and Malaysia, we are facing the price challenge. Today, every electrical appliances and electronic, the price is gone down. So the value in GDP is a price multiplied by quality. You never know what be bigger one between price or quality. It might be more important to us in terms of quantity, but because of the technology advance, make the price gone down, and look at the GDP, it might be smaller, but actually it would be a source of growth and employment. That is a complicated thing that we need to study more. We need more understanding. We need more research to get a better understanding about this process. But so far we are not, and we facing another sentiment about the industrial policy. Government jump in everywhere. We are in the global subsidy race. People put the money, government money, to draw reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, every shoring except offshoring. That is a challenging that we need to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think just straight two quick comments. One is I want to talk the Bangladesh question also for the same way. The thing is that, actually it's easier to move from a lower to middle income country. Paradoxically, why? It's just getting workers out of agriculture to manufacturing. Like, it sounds very difficult, but still possible, because there are many examples of that. But moving from middle income to high income, it's very difficult because it needs to change in institutional governance. Why is it that there are so few middle income countries become high income? Even in this region, you can count on your fingers, maybe not even fingers, it's just literally just a few. And why in the developing world, there are very few countries to move to high income in the last 10, 15, 20 years. It cannot be a coincidence, right? So that's something I've been arguing, that this is an institutional problem. The low income to middle income is an economic transformation problem. The middle to upper income is a institutional problem. And that takes the Bangladesh example, because Bangladesh has done very well with ready-made garments. But Bangladesh has just not been able to upgrade its manufacturing. It's still stuck in this low price, high quantity, what Achan is mentioning, kind of manufacturing, which can get you some distance, but not get you very far. Right, and that's exactly the challenge that countries like Bangladesh are facing, especially as they graduate from LDC status, because they lose then some of their ready-made garments too, markets too. So this thing about how to, even in the manufacturing, to move up the value chain is not just about economic factors, but also institutional and governance factors, right? So this is the biggest challenge, I think, facing countries like Thailand and even Bangladesh, which is not yet a middle income country, because that transition is a very complex transition, also involving politics, right? Because you have to take on certain very powerful actors in the ready-made garments, such as Bangladesh, for example, so that they do not take all the rents that are in the system. So it's a complex problem, but it's an important question to keep in mind that the middle income trap is actually a genuinely institutional trap, right? So that's something that, the Bangladesh example comes back to that. The methods question.
May I jump in, please, Kunal?
And Andy, may you want to answer this question, because Andy is the one who's been looking at the data very closely. So Peter, you can come in very briefly, because I want to also make sure that there's some space for Valirat and Titi to join in. Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Yes. I think Achanan touched exactly on the right point there, and you mentioned this too, Kunal. Moving from agriculture to labor-intensive manufacturing and low-level services can be achieved without any real retraining of the people concerned. But the movement from labor-intensive manufacturing to high value-added manufacturing can only be achieved with a high level of training. So Achanan, I'm not telling Achanan anything new here, because we did a study together on Thailand's automotive sector, including both final assembly and parts manufacturing. And Achanan, you'll remember that the comment that every manufacturer made to us was their big problem was getting skilled workers. So in my opinion, the middle income trap is a reality. Thailand illustrates it. And the source of the middle income trap is investment in education. That is the crucial thing. And while I'm talking, Kunal, may I address the big question that has come up in the comparison of Thailand, Indonesia? Why is it that Cousinating tension didn't really occur in either country? Why didn't inequality increase? And I offer the answer that the difference between Thailand, Indonesia, and the Cousinating story is productivity growth in agriculture. The point that Titik made towards the end of her presentation. Inequality overall is highly sensitive to what happens to rural incomes, because the rural people are the poorest in the country by far. So a path of development that raises the incomes of rural people, not just the people who migrate to the urban center, but rural people themselves, is going to reduce inequality. Technical change in agriculture, Thailand and Indonesia both illustrate this point, that you can get structural transformation with reducing inequality, because the technical change that occurred in agriculture was labor saving. It increased output, but at the same time reduced resources, labor in particular, to be used in other sectors. So that technical change in agriculture was a driver of the process of structural change, which was inequality reducing and income increasing. I think that's the key lesson from the Thailand and Indonesia stories.
Thanks, Peter. That's really very insightful, because you often forget agriculture is the driver of this process. Because I think agriculture is just about getting people out of agriculture, but actually technical change, productivity growth, agriculture drives this process of then both structural transformation, but also making sure inequality does not increase. I don't know, Andy, are you online? Because there's a question about methods and data, especially on inequality. Did you get that question? Yeah.
Yeah, we can look at different measures of inequality, and the Palmer is quite useful, because the one thing that the Palmer shows is changes in inequality seem to be a sort of direct competition between the rich and the poor. So, one thing that we can see in across much of East Asia is, there's larger shares to the poorest 40% compared to other parts of the world, and maybe that's an important aspect to bear in mind when it comes to thinking about domestic demand. A lot of the discussion, of course, is inevitably about thinking about sort of, exports and external demand, because that's the way countries have developed very rapidly. But perhaps there's more to be thought about in terms of domestic demand and ways of driving that. I think in terms of modern services, I think the optimism is probably shifting on that, partly because of the whole chat GPT expansion into generative AI. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people who are doing basic coding in Indonesia, where you probably only need 1/10 of those jobs now. You need one person who can do maybe 20 of those jobs. So I think actually modern services might that may be a kind of red herring now in a way, and maybe there's more focus needed on domestic demand. I mean, there'll always be a need for health workers, teachers, and education, particularly sort of shifting over the next sort of 20 years. So maybe there's sort of more to be said on the sort of domestic side of things, domestic demand, and particularly public goods around health and education that were very important actually during the sort of 70s and 80s in East Asia. I think on the data side of things, as over time, it's becoming, the quality of what's available in terms of inequality data is dramatically increasing. And so there's a sort of open question, I suppose, about whether to continue to focus on the Gini, or whether to take these other measures into account, or to go down the direction of the sort of top incomes of Piketty. I think survey data still serves an important purpose, even if you have administrative data to add to survey data, in that it gives you a sense of what's going on across the distribution. And so there may be other ways of looking at the data, but for the moment, I think the kind of survey data, which you can use for Palmer or Gini is a useful way to sort of think about these things. I suppose just sort of thinking a bit back to the SDGs, sorry, jumping around with my comments a bit. Maybe there's more emphasis needed on those kind of structural transformation jobs SDGs. The emphasis tends to go on the poverty ones. But of course, it's, reaching the poverty goals, that'll be one thing. But then if the economy is not strong enough to sustain those incomes in the future, people may just slip back into poverty by whatever dimension. So I think if we could have much more sort of emphasis on those structural transformation SDGs, and presumably at some point we'll start to talk about after 2030, because the SDGs are so far off track, it's ridiculous. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding us. But I think that's really important to keep in mind that, you can create jobs even to the public sector, and health and education are obvious ones, because economists tend to have a very somewhat jaded view of the public sector, given our experience of the public sector in many countries in the region in the past. So that's a really interesting point. I just want to ask Ali Ratan, did you want to add anything more on the discussions? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, the last one.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe I attack the question about can least developing countries also contribute to the manufacturing, and how this development path go in the future. And also the question about the potential of the services given the AI development and so on. So maybe we go back to the basic economics, that the opportunity will come and go, right? The entrepreneur that will catch the opportunity. For example, we thought the manufacturing is going to be slowing down because the demand is saturated, but we have a green products demand because of the climate change. So there is new lineup of new demand that going to be available for all countries to supply. Then it goes back to the question whether your resources, including human capital, not only capital, but also other resources are able to meet the demand. That these entrepreneurs that the government need to facilitate to tap into the any opportunity that come in, so that the economy can grow. The opportunity can come from the manufacturing or the services. Although the AI is developing and challenge certain jobs, but it also creates a new job. Yeah, digitalization, development in technology, challenge some existing work, but also provide new jobs to certain people. For example, in Indonesia, maybe this is just a case. The digitalization, the advancement of technology create the motorbike taxi, and it helps workers in Metro Jakarta. However, it creates another problem because of the early development of this business. It provide high income, but they left their formal jobs and become a driver, for example. But of course, they are not anymore formal workers that get protection and so on. So it leaves another set of issues that need to be addressed. Also, another example that we have domestic helpers that used to recruit by ourselves from villages, for example, because of digitalization. Some company mobilize these domestic helpers so that the households can access better with some kind of assurance of the quality and so on. So opportunity lies in every sectors of the economy. It's just that how the players tap, and the collaboration between the entrepreneurs and the government can ensure that everyone get the benefit. I want to emphasize again on what Professor Peter War mentioned on the importance of education. So in order to move up the value chain or the ladder, for example, you are now specializing in the low skill industry or low skill sectors. With the education, some sort of short training can equip the workers with new skill, for example. So that's what we experiment, what we call with Prakerja program. So providing anyone leaving the school with a short-term training that at their wish. So if they want to do some kind of short, programming, they can get a short course on that programming, any kind. If they want to be able to establish a catering, they can get a training on on how to manage or develop a catering business, and so on and so forth. So the education can reduce the gap between rural and urban, skill and unskilled, and also sectoral based, because it improves the productivity of the labor. I think I end my comment on that. Maybe just a brief, because we ran out of time. I just like to add on the issue of future development model of Thailand. TDI has done some research on this issue, and TDI suggests that the future development issue of the future development model of Thailand should be modern agriculture and knowledge-based services, and that I think lots of the research has been doing on that. And I would like to add on the issues of aging society that the Thailand is facing right now, especially in Thai agriculture, a lot of aged farmers there, and climate change. And I think these two issues have to be taken into account more seriously for the case of Thailand if we want to develop knowledge-based services and modern agriculture that involve a lot of the majority of Thai people there, and maybe technology could do some help. And I believe UNU-WIDER have done lots of good research on this issue, and ESCAP will deliver the knowledge to the right desk of the policymakers, and that would help a lot to not only Thailand, but I think other countries as well. That's all. Thank you.
Very quickly end now. I was wondering, Ibu Armida, did you want to say anything at the end? Because there was lots of discussion on Indonesia and Thailand and Asia Pacific region, but what would be your key takeaway from apart from the book, but the discussion here for the future in terms of future research and maybe collaboration with ESCAP and WIDER, as was mentioned by Hamza on this. So what would be your key takeaway, you think? I can give you a mic. Take my mic, actually. Easy. I'm going to give it to you.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes. Thank you very much for, I think, the very rich presentation as well as discussion. I enjoyed very much. So further in depth, rather than only reading the book, right? But hearing the discussion and the future insight. So I think, if I may, I would like to go back to my earlier, let's say, remarks at the opening, in which going forward, I think several of the key issues, emerging issues, that needs to be taken into account. And I'm very pleased also to hear that it's being also commented, which are sort of this part of that are the emerging mega trends, but part of this ongoing also, what is happening, including this digital transformation for sure, emerging technologies, because that is very big in our region. Second is climate change and all that impact. Third is, again, this population, the demographics, the evolving demographic structure, which are quite different across the countries. Again, Thailand is even, I was informed, whether it's true or not, Thailand's total fertility rate is even lower than Japan. But why we are not feeling as such here? Because of the migration, migrant workers, right? Coming from Myanmar, to a large extent, less from Cambodia, Laos, right? Because they look alike, right? And they even speak Thai, so we don't feel that. But in other countries may be different. So therefore, again, yeah, in terms of policy implication, this should be part. Yeah. Not to mention impact on inequality and all that, right? But as part of the policy implication, this has to be part, more coordinated and all that, right? So I think this emerging issues is very important. Yeah, you cannot look at the issues and so on at the vacuum. This is dynamic. Secondly, because we are ESCAP, right? To reiterate the point that Hamza mentioned earlier, ESCAP Regional Commission, we have also this function, this very important function of intergovernmental, not only doing research, not only supporting countries, yeah, the national, work, but also the very important intergovernmental. Yes, so then again, yeah, we invite, of course, Kunal and colleagues wider. You have very good research, you have very good policy recommendation, you need to channel it somewhere. Otherwise, it just sits like, in academics university. Yeah, I think you should also promote that and engage it in a much wider way. Yeah, so in that regard, we would be very happy, yeah, to partner further with you. So with that, maybe again, thank you very much. A big appreciation to all colleagues. Thank you.
Everyone, we went a little bit over time, but it probably was worth it. We had a good discussion. Also, actually, not only here among us, but also we had Andy Sumner and Peter Wall giving some very good comments too. So really a very rich set of comments from both here and from those colleagues joining online. Thanks so much for your time. And we already have a set of issues to think about for the next project, perhaps between ESCAP and WIDER going forward, emerging issues that are coming up in the region, demographic issues, climate change, technologies, and so on. So look forward to that. And thanks again for being here. And thanks, Andy and Peter. Thanks for so waiting for us. It's good. That's very good. Thank you. Very interesting observation.
Recording stopped.
No, I'm UN wider. You can yeah. Because the UNU page was part here, but yeah, where you got it. Yeah, it's quite common.